There's a famous Zen koan that asks, "What is your original face?" It has an interesting story behind it. The sixth patriarch of Zen was a man named Ino, and he was a cook in the monastery. He didn't actually participate in the sort of pious activities of monastery life. He didn't participate in the daily meditations and the sutra chanting and the teaching and lecture attending and all of that. He simply cooked for the other monks. One day the fifth patriarch was trying to figure out who to leave his monastery to when he died. Who would be in charge? Who would be the teacher? And he couldn't actually figure out an answer to that question. I mean, that's not a question that you ought to be able to figure out on your own, all right, just through powers of discernment, because then whatever choice you make is really just limited to what you think, right? There needs to be some sort of a sign from the other person that they can step into that role and fulfill it. And so he issued a kind of a challenge to see who is out there. Who is it that's there already that I'm not seeing? And so he said, "Someone write me an enlightened poem." That was the test. So the head monk, who thought of himself as, his name was Myo, that's the Japanese anyway, he thought of himself as being the person who would succeed at the monastery. And so he wrote a very pious poem, and it says something like this. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but he says, "The mind is a mirror, the body is its stand. We must dust it perpetually so that no impurities can be found on it." And that seems pretty good. A person who's dedicated to constant practice, constantly polishing the mind to make sure it's still and calm and pure and clean. But the monk, the cook monk, came along, and he was illiterate. He couldn't read. So he said, "What's that?" Somebody explained to him. It's a little bit like David coming up on the field of battle and saying, "Who's that giant out there? And what's all this talk about someone going out to slay him?" You know, and somebody comes along and says, "Oh well, you know, it's a big thing about that. You know, if you kill the giant, you know, we win the war, and you get to marry the king's daughter, right?" So Eno comes along. He's sort of an innocent. He says, "Well, what's this?" He says, "It's a poem." "What does it say?" He says, "But what do you get if you write a good poem that's better than that?" He says, "Oh, you get to run the monastery." He goes, He says, "There's no mirror. So how could there be a stand? And if there's no mirror, where is there any place for dust to collect?" And so the fifth patriarch comes along and sees that poem and says, "Who wrote this?" And they said, "I don't know. We'll find out." It's the cook. So he has the cook brought to him in the middle of the night, and he gives him his robe and his bowl, which are symbolic of the transmission, and says, "Run for your life, because the pious people will kill you for these things." Good advice, right? Run for your life, because the pious people will kill you for these symbols. And so he leaves in the middle of the night with the robe and the bowl. He races up the mountain as fast as he can for his dear life, you know, because he sees the real thing, and there's nothing religion hates more than that. So Myo hears what's happened. This is the head monk. And so he rushes up the mountain as fast as he can, following the trail of little Eno. And finally he tracks him down. He says, "Give those to me." And Eno says, "If you want them, take them." And he sets them down on the ground. And so, this is where it gets sort of fairy tale-like. It's really wonderful. What happens is that Myo goes up to pick up the robe and the bowl, and they weigh as much as a mountain. He cannot pick them up. And Eno says, "Go ahead, take them. I don't want them. They're yours. If you care so much about this, have them. They're just symbols. I just have to carry them around, you know. If you steal them, I don't have to carry them anymore." He's willing to part with them. But of course, Myo realizes at that moment that he doesn't really just want the trappings of religion. He really does want the teaching. He really does want this inner sort of vernacular contact with what we would call God. That's what he wants. He doesn't want all the pious language. He doesn't want all the symbols. He doesn't want the incense. He doesn't want any of that stuff. And so he says, give me the real teaching. And so, says, oh, okay, in that case, without thinking good or evil, tell me, what is your original face? What is your original face? The face you had before your parents were born. In other words, what's your real being? What do you really think? How do you really feel? Who is really living inside of this body? Who is really living this life? Who is really seeking happiness, and how? And is it working? These are all real important questions. And if the questions are asked, they're invariably answered. The problem is they never get asked. That's the only problem. We don't really ask those questions because we don't really occupy that inner space.